Welcome, I'm Glen Anderson, producer and host of this TV series, Glen's Parallax Perspectives. This series explores a wide variety of issues related to peace, social and economic justice, the environment, and nonviolent social change. We especially provide opportunities for the public to hear voices and viewpoints that are rarely heard in mainstream media. Mainstream media, politicians, and culture see the world in conventional ways. The establishment is stuck in how they see the world. In order to solve problems, we need to see things differently. This TV series, Glen's Parallax Perspectives, can help us see things differently so we can solve problems at all levels, from the local to the global. This series is called Glen's Parallax Perspectives. Here's what the word parallax means. Put one finger in front of your nose and another finger farther away. Close one eye, then open that eye and close the other. Your fingers will seem to move. This is called a parallax view. This TV series invites you to look at issues from fresh perspectives. Also, see much information about the issues that we cover in this TV series and previous episodes of this series at my blog, www.parallaxperspectives.org. And now I invite you to watch this month's program. This month's interview on Glen's Parallax Perspectives TV program provides information that very few people know. We'll talk about international courts that support fairness and uphold international law. We'll also help you understand what war crimes are and how they can be dealt with through international law. I'm happy to welcome our well-informed guest, Joanne Dufour. Joanne has an extensive background with the United Nations, the International Red Cross, and International Humanitarian Law. In fact, a couple of years ago, I took a course from her about International Humanitarian Law, and then we later produced one of these TV programs about that. I've enjoyed working with Joanne on a bunch of issues, including abolishing nuclear weapons. Joanne is exceptionally skilled in explaining big issues in ways that ordinary people can easily understand. So if you don't already know much about international law, international courts, war crimes, you will learn a lot. And Joanne is so skilled at explaining things clearly that you actually will be able to absorb the information and enjoy learning about this. So this will be fun. We'll all have a good time learning about these important issues. So welcome, Joanne. Good to have you here.
Thank you. Nice to be here again.
Yep. And we'll be talking about international courts, and you have some slides that you've prepared. You can bring up the first one that just has the title of what we're doing.
Here we go.
International Courts and War Crime Overview. And the next slide you can show is
Wait a second, it's not.
We're not getting the full image there.
Yeah, I know. It's not working. You are share screening, but I can't get this to move.
There it is.
There it is.
And there's the next slide, that this is our special thing. Now I'll ask you to tell us overall what international courts are. You prepared a definition here on the screen. Can you help us understand the concept and what international courts do?
Okay. Well, let me first of all clarify international law, because international law is law that is created by international organizations or countries working together, like a treaty or resolutions of the United Nations. So when it comes to a court, the court is deciding on cases relating to international law. So what is the court? Well, it's an organization or a body of an international organization. So it could be like the UN or one of their agencies that hears cases in which one party may be a state or an international organization, and which is composed of independent judges, and we'll explain that further, who follow predetermined rules of procedure to issue binding decisions on the basis of this international law.
Okay. Can you bring up the next slide and tell us the history?
Sure. The history is interesting. You know, there's a lot of history about international law that goes back way in time that we don't appreciate. But more recently, the courts that we're familiar with in our generation are the courts that followed World War II, ones at Nuremberg and Tokyo. And they were prosecuting what we called war criminals. There's now courts that are located in The Hague in the Netherlands. And these are both the Court of Justice, the International Court of Justice, and the International Criminal Court. That's the more recent one. But in addition to international courts, there have been special cases where war crimes have been committed, and there were courts that were held outside of The Hague, like the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia or for Rwanda, and they dealt with ethnic cleansing that was going on in Yugoslavia and the genocide in Rwanda. These actually did take place in The Hague, but then there were other cases of courts, like a special court for Sierra Leone or for Lebanon or for Dili district in East Timor in Indonesia. Now, these were actually located in those areas themselves.
Wow.
So the idea of an international court isn't just restricted to The Hague.
Okay, thanks. Can you show us? Oh, there's the building that in The Hague is the city in the Netherlands. It's known as the International City of Peace and Justice, and is a big, beautiful building where the International Court of Justice is located, right?
Right. Now, the International Court of Justice was an idea that Queen Juliana thought of at the end of the 19th century, the late 1800s.
Okay.
And by 1913, they actually had this building built. So it's a very, very old, well, I mean, it's over a century old.
Yeah.
And so and this now houses the International Court of Justice.
Okay.
And that's a very interesting court because it has 15 justices.
You have a slide. Our next slide is about that, right?
Well, yes, but what it doesn't say is that it has 15 justices that sit there, and they are all justices that know about international law. You have to specialize in that branch of the law field. And they're the ones that settle disputes between states. Queen Juliana was always worried that states were fighting each other and having wars, and couldn't there be some kind of a place where they could arbitrate what they disagree on rather than going to war? And that was her dream. Okay.
Yeah. And when it's the states, that means nations.
Nations, exactly.
In the United States, we have 50 states, but this is really nations, which are called states at the international level.
Yeah, in international parlance, sometimes they talk about member states instead of member countries or member nations.
Yeah.
Because you're members of the court.
Yeah.
And I guess member state sounds easier or something.
Yeah.
It's the only international court that adjudicates, means decides disputes between countries. There's no other place in the world that a country can go to if they have a problem with another country and they just don't want to go and use force or use violence to solve their disagreements.
Great.
And so the judges, these 15 judges, issue a ruling or an opinion, and that serves as one of the sources of international law.
Okay. You've got the next slide is about something that I remember from 1996 when I heard that the International Court of Justice issued an advisory opinion about the legality of nuclear weapons. It didn't say it's illegal to have them, it's illegal to use them or threaten, which is a pretty fine distinction, I think. But tell us about this slide.
Okay, well, 1996 is right. And it turns out that there was a judge. He lives in New York right now, and he represented the country of the Marshall Islands. And the Marshall Islands had been the area where the U.S. tested bombs after they detonated the bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They tested 68 bombs on the islands in the Marshall Islands. And so these people wanted to stop the testing and stop having anybody else go through what they went through. And so they went to this court, this ICJ, to ask whether or not they could make nuclear weapons illegal. Well, they didn't. But they did come out with this decision that states must never make civilians the object of attack. Now, that's where they're talking about something called the Geneva Conventions that the Red Cross developed. So, and that they reinforced that idea about humanitarian law. And they must consequently, the states or the countries, must consequently never use weapons that are incapable of distinguishing between civilian and military targets. Now, that language is lifted right out of humanitarian law.
Yeah.
But I wanted to make sure that we understand what's going on now. And so the ICJ is currently conducting what Russia has been doing in the Ukraine. This was a request that was made to the court by President Zelensky. And so they agreed that you know, the actions that were going on should be investigated. And I'll tell you more about the conditions that they use.
Yeah, I remember when in 1996 when this came out, and in the peace movement, we thought, great, here's a great victory for our side. This was in the news as a tiny, tiny news item one day, and then it just vanished again. And we're back to the status quo, regardless of international law and regardless of the International Court of Justice.
We're not supporters of international law.
No, the United States has always been an opponent because as Americans, we feel entitled to do any damn thing we want, and we don't want the rest of the world to tell us what we can and can't do. And that this, of course, was Trump's thing, but this has been a U.S. thing for a long, long, long time. Trump did not invent that concept of saying to the rest of the world, you go to hell, we'll do as we damn well please. That's been U.S. policy. Tell us about the Nuremberg Trials. This is powerful stuff. People have probably heard about Nuremberg Trials, but maybe don't understand what was going on.
Exactly. Well, this was in a time when the United States really did show some leadership and was among the victory countries in World War II to try to see what could be done. Remember, World War II had the genocide of not only the Jews, but a range of people, disabled people and the Polish civilians and people who were resisting in other countries. So what they decided to do, well, this is just a little bit of historical background, that right after the war ended and the charter for the Nuremberg, to have trials at Nuremberg, was established and signed on August 8th, 1945. This is right after the war ended in Europe. It was still going on in Japan. But and it was, as a matter of fact, 3 months after the Germans had surrendered, right? But more importantly, 2 days after August 8th is 2 days after August 6th, when the Hiroshima bomb was tested, and 1 day before Nagasaki. So the war is still going on when they decided that they were going to have trials in Nuremberg, Germany. And what was the outcome of the Nuremberg trials? Well, that trial took place before the Tokyo trial, because of course they had to go through the surrender of Japan and establish the fact that there would be a similar trial in Tokyo. So this one came first. So what did they decide? And that is that an individual is responsible, and in this case, individuals are talking about soldiers. They are responsible for what they do and will be held accountable for committing serious crimes under international law. So that means that you can't say that I am ordered to kill this innocent person, and because I'm just following orders. If it is an illegal act, the soldier must not obey it. Okay, and that's the change. Before this, as long as they were following orders, you could get away with continuous murder, which goes on in wars, right?
Right. Now,
So
of course, go ahead.
Okay, so these serious crimes include the ones that it's planning for, preparing for, participating in acts of aggressive warfare, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. So that's what we're starting to hear the kinds of expression about war crimes and crimes against humanity. It came after Nuremberg.
Right. Now, as you mentioned, this pertains to the individual soldiers. And I know this is part of the actual training they get when you're in the military, and they'll train you and say you can't obey an illegal order. But all these orders that we do for all these stupid wars are illegal under international law, and they don't distinguish that. And also, the Nuremberg principles should be affecting national leaders too. The people who give the orders to bomb other countries. The United States, just like Russia has attacked and bombed hospitals and stuff, the United States has done that in Iraq and other places too. So we need to really uphold the law and make sure that it pertains to everybody, including all nations and the leaders of nations, not just individual soldiers.
Well, that was something that the people, the defendants at Nuremberg were all generals who ordered acts that were illegal. And they were acting on behalf of their government. All right. So they were essentially following orders. I mean, Hitler was authorizing these things. And they were in compliance with his orders. But they're developed over time. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could hold individuals responsible?
Yeah.
That was an idea that came up, and it blossomed in something called the Rome Statute. And they wrote a Rome Statute and created something called an International Criminal Court, where individuals, not countries, were going to be brought to this court for war crimes and other acts, the heinous acts that they commit during a war situation.
Yeah, and you're showing on the screen the building where the International Court of Justice is, right?
Well, this is a building that, even though the court didn't come into existence until 2002, by 2014, they finished building this building. It's also in The Hague. It's supposed to be an absolutely beautiful building. They have a range of architects that worked on it. And anyway, it's something that people feel very inspired by when they go to this court.
Now, go ahead, tell us the next slide here. What's there?
Okay, now this is how the court works. Remember, it's I mentioned this Rome Statute, and that gives it jurisdiction over 4 main crimes. So these are as long as a crime qualifies as being one of the 4, the case will be accepted by the ICC. But you have to prove that that's what the defendant is being charged with. Okay, so the first is the crime of genocide, which is the mass killing of a particular group of people. The second is something called crimes against humanity, which can be a form of genocide, but it's not necessarily restricted to one group of people. It might be multiple groups of people. And there are 15 forms of crimes against humanity listed. So they're talking about murder or rape or imprisonment, enforced disappearances, enslavement, okay, particularly of women, children, sexual slavery, torture, apartheid. So these are crimes that can occur outside of war as well. We're not just talking about war crimes. I mean, crimes that are happening during war. Of course, if these things happen during war, they are criminal offenses. Then there are grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions. Now, the Geneva Conventions are only applicable in a setting of war. Human rights treaties guide what goes on when we're not at war. When we are at war, the parties that are at war are obliged to follow the Geneva Conventions. So if you're killing or torturing persons, such as civilians or prisoners, or you have direct attacks on hospitals or historic monuments or specialized buildings that have nothing to do with being a military target, that would be a war crime. Okay. The 4th crime is called a crime of aggression. It took the longest time for the text of that crime to be actually written out and defined. So it took 8 years, and they finally came up with a suitable explanation of what crimes of aggression are. Now we're going to talk more about Ukraine in future slides, but I just wanted to say that there are some groups that want actions that Russia has committed as being crimes of aggression. Others are saying, no, they're crimes against humanity. So if cases are being brought to the ICC and the ICC is investigating cases, they have to be defined. You're under which set of procedures, because these are all highly detailed and spelled out in the codes.
Right.
Now, just to give you a background, we were talking about member states here. So you actually, a country has to agree. You are signing a treaty when you join the International Criminal Court. And so there have countries that have signed it and then changed their minds, like the US. President Clinton, on his last day of office, signed on to the treaty with reservations. President Bush, on his following first day in office, unsigned. So we had a new administration that made a 180-degree turn. But Israel did the same thing, and Russia signed and then withdrew, and Sudan. So this is something that only the US has done. And the US reason is because they were afraid of their own soldiers being accused of war crimes, probably rightfully, but they wanted to protect those soldiers. So you can see it is not an easy issue. There are some countries that just have never considered signing on, including the list of 10 countries that's listed on the right.
Okay, go ahead with the next one. There we go.
Okay, now we're actually talking about what's a war crime per se. Okay, so we're saying that if you violate in a serious way international humanitarian law or the Geneva Conventions, that's the same thing, that and we're defining what a violent way is, that and you're doing it against not only persons, preferably civilians are the ones that you are not ever supposed to target, but if you're doing it against property too, if you're citing monuments or citing reservoirs or citing electrical plants or something. So the war crime is willful killing. That doesn't mean the killing that is allowed during the conflict, but that is like after hours killing. Sometimes soldiers get so into the war that they go out and start to kill innocent civilians after the actual battle is over. Torture and inhuman treatment is definitely considered a war crime that can go on during a war or not. Willfully causing great suffering. If you have used landmines or you've used weapons in a conventional war setting that are just horrible weapons, like we outlawed mustard gas because it was such a horrible weapon, but you decide to use some kind of biological weapon that really has detrimental effects.
Well, in Vietnam, the United States used napalm, which is kind of like a jellied gasoline. It's extremely painful and destructive to human bodies. We've used white phosphorus that burns, and you cannot wash it off with water. The water makes it burn worse.
And napalm, it's still legal to use napalm because napalm is nothing more than a defoliant. And what we did is used it at its strongest level.
Yeah.
If you use it in a watered down form, it's fine. You know, it'll take your weeds away, but that's not how we used it. So, and they have still not made it illegal to use it. If there's extensive destruction and appropriation of property, and again, we're talking about if a religious site is destroyed, a church or a mosque is deliberately destroyed. The taking of hostages is not allowed. Willfully depriving a prisoner of war or other protected persons of the rights of air and regular trial. You know, the Geneva Conventions very specifically spells out exactly how you should be treating a prisoner of war. We were not doing it in Guantanamo. We were torturing people in Guantanamo, and that had to be stopped because when you take a prisoner of war, you cannot torture them. compelling a protected person to serve in the forces of a hostile power. That means you take some of the civilians and you recruit them and you put them on the front lines on your side. Even though they are on the enemy side, you have now captured them and asked them or told them that you would now be fighting with us, not against us. Those are all examples of war crimes. Now, interestingly enough, well, let's do this one first, because let's distinguish and see, these are the fundamental principles of the Geneva Conventions or humanitarian law. Remember, in our situation, it's called the law of armed conflict in the United States. But all the countries in the world have signed on to humanitarian law. And these are the laws that pertain in a wartime situation. So the first one is it's a war. And militaries are allowed to fight militaries in a war. That's what war is all about. And killing is okay. The soldier has the authority to kill as long as he's killing the appropriate enemy. All right. So the military necessity spells out exactly what the Army or the Navy or the Air Force or the Marines or whatever armed service you're talking about can do to conduct the war. But not anything they want. Now here is where the Red Cross steps in and said, but you have to distinguish between civilians and soldiers. You must. If you are deliberately targeting civilians in a war, that's illegal. Civilians are not supposed to be taking part in a war. Therefore, they have the protection of the Geneva Conventions. Proportionality.
Let me just add to that distinction thing. This is one of the reasons, one of the ways in which nuclear weapons are inherently illegal, because they violate the Geneva Conventions. Nuclear weapons do not limit themselves to killing only the military of the other side. They kill entire populations. Exactly. And because nuclear weapons violate that IHL principle of distinguishing between civilians versus military troops, that makes nuclear weapons inherently illegal.
And the Red Cross said that right after Hiroshima. Yeah. Because the Red Cross was in on Hiroshima, saw the damage that was done. It was a city that was targeted, and it was civilians that were targeted, and they said this is absolutely wrong. Okay. Proportionality has to do with if some kind of shooting takes place and you want to say, wait a second, we're going to show them they can't do this and get away with it. And you respond with much stronger weapons, and sometimes it's 100 times the intensity of what was done to you. Sometimes it could even be 1,000 times. And there are countries that have done this. And that is absolutely illegal. That if you're in a military situation, you should use about the same degree, quantity, or intensity that the opening side first used. You're not supposed to overwhelm them. Okay, that's wrong. And limiting unnecessary suffering, well, that, they decided that landmines are illegal because they were unnecessary suffering. And yes, if the landmines are affecting the troops, it's possible. But then after the war, the landmines aren't picked up and the civilians are jeopardized. So that's why I'm trying to make sure you're avoiding unnecessary suffering.
I want to make another point about the proportionality. In the United States, when a new president comes in, they spend a lot of time, maybe a year or so, figuring out what's our new administration's policy about nuclear weapons going to be. And they call this the Nuclear Posture Review. And it's a statement saying when we think nuclear weapons are okay to use and stuff like that. When Trump came in, his Nuclear Posture Review violated that principle of proportionality, because he said, instead of just using nuclear weapons if we're attacked or blah, 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 we will use U.S. nuclear weapons for lower level kinds of attacks on the U.S. if somebody attacks our infrastructure, we can retaliate with nuclear weapons and so forth. Biden came in and he left a lot of Trump's violations of that proportionality principle in place. So Biden is continuing some of the Trump disproportionate policy. So ordinary people need to pay attention to that stuff.
Yeah, but Obama also violated the proportionality in his
Right.
nuclear policy review. Yeah, and so Trump just built on it and made it more precise and included more areas.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
Biden is loyal to Obama, probably.
right.
I don't.
Yeah. So what happens in the United States is that both political parties are hell-bent to use nuclear weapons anytime they damn well feel like it. And this is not a partisan thing, but there's a system of institutional momentum within the whole military-industrial complex that keeps wanting to escalate. Both parties are in on that. Go ahead.
But it's a violation of the law of armed conflict. And the law of armed conflict agrees with the Geneva Conventions. It is the Geneva Conventions. Then, in our case, it is the responsibility of the armed service to court-martial whoever violated that. So we have done in cases of torture, for example, in Abu Ghraib. Yeah, the people who were in the jails, who were doing some of the torture in the jails, they got court-martialed and they got sent to prison for a period of time. But the people who ordered them above, they got scot-free. Some of them got medals, even though they were saying, yes, go ahead and torture those guys, it's fine. So we do say that we follow the Geneva Conventions, but do we really? Okay, an example of a war crime is employing, now this is what the criminal court is saying, okay? And this is the one that's holding individuals responsible. So if you're using weapons, projectiles, and material and methods of warfare which are of a nature to cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering, or which are inherently discriminate. So that is, even if you're using a drone and you're using a drone at a wedding party, that would be considered a war crime. A wedding party is not a military target. And we've done that in Afghanistan. Now, I will go on to talk about Ukraine here. The International Criminal Court currently has an investigating team in Ukraine gathering evidence on the war crimes. They've been there since the first month, right after the ICJ went in at Zelensky's request. So did the International Criminal Court. Information has been and is being gathered of those responsible for actually ordering the criminal act and on the act itself. Now, there have been 50,000 cases of war crimes that have been tallied by these investigating teams. I heard a number since I wrote this particular slide, because I'm saying there have been over 30,000, but I've heard the number 50,000 recently documented in Ukraine. So let me tell you the kinds of things, if you haven't already guessed. There have been massacres, murder of civilians and soldiers, indiscriminate attacks on densely populated areas, so there was deliberate attacks on civilians, attacking critical civilian infrastructures, so they were doing things like hospitals and schools, as well as some environmental areas. There has been signs of torture. There have been cases of rape and sexual enslavement of women and children. There have been cases of children being stolen. And those are just some of the samples of the 50,000 cases that have been reported. Okay, let's see if I can get this. Now, under the Geneva Conventions, or the law of armed conflict, there are precisely stated what is protected. And remember, Russia signed on to the Geneva Conventions, China signed on to the Geneva Conventions, every country has signed on to the Geneva Conventions. So this is across the board. So who was protected? Well, civilians, wounded and sick combatants. So once a combatant is not able to, is shot or is not able to function, you're not treating him as an enemy anymore. He becomes a prisoner. Prisoners of war are persons deprived of their freedom. They are protected now. You cannot kill them. Persons who accompany the armed forces without actually being members. Those are some of the groups that provide food services or special accommodations or special provisions. The war correspondents. There was a war correspondent, an American war correspondent that I found out was killed in Ukraine. And so we have the right now to find out who was responsible for that and to bring that person to justice. Supply contractors, service providers, any one of these people, if they have been targets, that is a war crime. Military, medical, and religious personnel. So that means Red Cross staff or any of the religious personnel, the chaplains of any denomination. Merchant, marine, and civil aircraft are exempt. Red Cross and other relief personnel. Do you notice who is not on this list? Who's not protected? The most obvious. Who's supposed to be able to kill and be killed?
Oh, the military people.
The military, they are not protected. When you go and sign up for the military, yes, your life is at stake. And by the same token, you are allowed to kill. All right. So there's no protection for you. That's why they want to distinguish, but you cannot act irrationally and go and take out your feelings on groups that are not supposed to be targeted. So there's also the what. Remember property? The ICJ said you can't violate property either. So civilian property. I mean, if they're people's homes, why are you targeting ordinary homes? Medical facilities, cultural and historical sites, religious facilities, objects indispensable for the survival of the civilian population. Works containing dangerous forces. Well, Zaporizhia is a nuclear power plant, right? That can be pretty dangerous if that's a target. And the natural environment as well. So I think you have, if you have been watching the news, you can see that these areas have been targeted. That's why we're having 50,000 cases of war crimes. So this one is our last slide, but this tells a lot about who can handle this, because this is to expect that the International Criminal Court is going to handle 50,000 cases is totally unrealistic. So who can and who is actually in Ukraine handling a number of these cases? First of all, it's not only countries in Ukraine, the district courts in Ukraine. There are district courts in the UK, there are district courts in a range of countries. There is something called the Joint Investigation Team. And that is the countries of Estonia, Latvia, Slovakia, Romania, Poland, Lithuania, and the Ukraine have gotten together with the International Criminal Court, and they're all in the process of trying to see which kinds of cases they might be able to handle in their own district courts. The majority of the district courts is taking, and the process of having trials is taking place in Ukraine, but also in the UK, and also in some of the other countries. And the reason that they can do this is because of the jurisdictions that national courts have. Now, I don't have a slide on this because I just learned this yesterday, but let me share this with you. The national court, an ordinary court in a country, a national court, has a jurisdiction, if the crime took place in that court, in that country. Okay? If the crime took place in that country, obviously the court can try the case. But it can also try a case of nationality. That means if you had a member of your own country go and commit a crime in another country, you can try that person on the basis of nationality. In other words, we get protection of being a civilian unless we're also a criminal. And then the courts can come after us, even if we were to commit a crime. If I cross the border into Canada and I kill somebody, I can be tried in an American court for that. Okay. We can also, this is an interesting one, it's called passive personality. And that is if, that's why I mentioned that there was an American journalist who was killed in the Ukraine. That's how the United States has gone into the Ukraine. You know, the Attorney General was there just last week. And he is saying we will use our own resources to be able to help train people and to process people. But in the meantime, we have an American journalist that was killed. So we're going to use this passive personality. If that person is identified, we can ask that he or she be extradited over to the United States and be held responsible in a court of law in the United States. And that's what's called passive personality. If your security is affected, if you're finding out that someone used conventional bombs and bombed your reservoir, okay, or blew up your bridge, okay, you can also, if it's an area where your security has been affected, then you have the right, a judge in a district court has the right to try that person in his or her court. But the most interesting one is this universal jurisdiction. Universal jurisdiction gives the right to any judge in a country whose law has said our judges can do this. And 3/4 of the countries in the world have said this, 3/4 of the countries. If their judges have the right to say, if anyone committed one of these heinous crimes, one of these horrible crimes, and they are known as a person who conducted a torture camp or was engaged in just mass killing, and they show up in your country, you as the judge have the right to bring them into your court and try them. But they have to be in your country. In other words, the criminal who committed the act wherever the war was, or for example, this was a case where I'm trying to think of the Chilean head of state who went to Spain.
General Pinochet.
Pinochet, thank you very much. When Pinochet went to Spain, the Spanish judge said, "You're here now. Guess what? You're not going back home, fella."
No.
And that was because he was having the right. He felt that what he had done as president was so outrageous that he had to be held accountable. Okay. And that because it wasn't happening in Chile, but he was taking a vacation. Now, we have had people like President Bush who had been accused of war crimes. He better not go to British Columbia. There's a British Columbia judge that said, you set foot in British Columbia, fella, and you're going to be in my court. So it goes both ways. Universal jurisdiction is a fascinating case. There have been a number of cases of universal jurisdiction, which have already been occurred. I think the number was 80, I heard yesterday. So it's not an unusual thing, but it's a fascinating thing when it comes to who, if somebody appears, a notorious criminal appears in your airport and shows up for a vacation or for visiting somebody, and you know that person is guilty or needs to be adjudicated, you as the judge can order that person to be taken and brought to your court. So that's a very, very fascinating piece. There is a problem with whether or not both the United States and Russia have not signed on to the International Criminal Court. We've taken a very, very strong stand about that. In Europe, when those countries are working they want to say that Russia's actions have been crimes of aggression. The United States doesn't want to say that. Why? Because we've committed crimes of aggression ourselves. And so we would be very much afraid if we take Russia to task for crimes of aggression, okay, that finger's going to turn right around and point at us. So we're not interested in talking about crimes of aggression. Crimes against humanity, yeah, that's okay. I mean, because that's really much broader, and we don't really pride ourselves on, going and committing crimes against humanity. I mean, because they're really bad crimes, and we try to get our soldiers behaving, even if we're committing a crime of aggression and we've invaded a country to protect them for something. We hope that our soldiers will behave and are not raping and stealing children and doing other things like that. So that's where I am with, and I hope if you can, that we're going to be following this. It was interesting that our Attorney General was in the Ukraine and has promised help. And there have been a number of countries that have promised help, because it's very expensive, especially if you take a case to the International Criminal Court. It is extremely expensive to gather all that evidence. And even in the district courts, I mean, when you go and the trial occurs, you have to present very convincing evidence for a conviction to occur. And interestingly enough, when I just checked this, the current president of the International Court of Justice is an American woman. There are 15 judges. There's an American, and she is now the president. She has a term of 9 years. She's about halfway through it. She just spoke at the United Nations recently as the president of the International Court of Justice. And her first vice president, that means if something happens to her, is a Russian man. So when they chose the leadership, they elected an American, and I guess the Russian didn't get enough votes to win, but he's next in line as the first vice president. So that just seems to be an interesting piece. The person who is the president of the International Criminal Court is a Polish judge, and that's the first time a Polish judge has been elected to that position. And they have 3-year terms in the International Criminal Court. So this whole thing about world courts gets to be interesting as you find out.
Yeah. Can you take down the slide that's on the screen?
Sure.
And then we can move on. We're near the end of the hour, and this has been fascinating. Besides the stuff I knew before that you've told us or taught us, you had new stuff here. So this is fun. There are more sources of information available. Every episode of my TV series provides a lot of substantial information, and I always encourage people to learn more about the topics that we discussed. And I've got a few that I can mention briefly here, and I'll post more information to my blog. The blog that I've had for 5 years now has not only the TV programs, but also for each TV program, I type up a thorough summary of what we said during that TV program, and then provide links to additional information. So you can visit that. The blog is www.parallaxperspectives.org. Parallax has 1 R and 2 L's, Parallax perspectives.org. Visit the blog. You can click TV programs and then click the link for this episode of my series titled International Courts and War Crimes. And since February of '87, I've done more than 400 of these programs. The last several years of these are on the blog, but I also have other blog categories for issue topics on climate, environment, nuclear weapons. This one, when I post to the blog, besides having it at the TV programs part, I'll also post it to the judicial part and the international part and the peace part. Joanne was the guest for my March 2020 TV program about international humanitarian law. And you can watch that video and or read the thorough summary I typed up about what we said. And again, that's at parallaxperspectives.org. And then the TV programs category, you can scroll down to that one. And let's see.
I think we had another program, didn't we, on nuclear weapons at some time?
We've done a bunch of programs on nuclear weapons, and those are the ones since the beginning of 2018. There have been several since the beginning of 2018. Those are at the TV programs part. They're also at the nuclear weapons part of the blog, and also at the nuclear weapons part are some of the older programs that I had done. The International Humanitarian Law and related topics are at the website for the International Red Cross, which is www.icrc.org, and www.redcross.org/humanity-in-war HTML includes a video about rules of war in a nutshell, they call it. And there's lots of stuff available, information. You can do a web search for Geneva Conventions, and you can do a web search on youtube.com for International Humanitarian Law. We've got some informative videos there. Also, Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. Go ahead, Joanne.
Well, I just wanted to say that I am indebted to an international lawyer, who had a program yesterday for us who do trainings with the Red Cross. And so a lot of the information that I provided, he taught me.
Yeah.
So I want to give him credit for that.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. And I want to thank Joanne Dufour for sharing her information, her knowledge, her insights, and her encouragement for us to be peaceful and humane. I also thank the people who've been watching this TV interview. At the weekly peace vigils that I organize and participate in downtown Olympia, I often hold signs that say, "We all share one earth," and human rights are for everyone, and all people are one human family. These are the kinds of values that can bring the general public in to help them recognize the validity of the kinds of things that Joanne's been talking about. And we can practice those not only at the international level, but also within our own society, if we can recognize that all people are one human family, even if you're in a religion that some people don't like, or you have a sexual orientation that some people don't like, or whatever. We're all in this together. People who want peace have to support human rights everywhere, and we have to support international law, and we have to support international courts. And sometimes our government in the United States has a kind of mixed record. They'll sometimes pay lip service to things, but not really be supported, and sometimes they're actually on the wrong side. I hope you'll tell your friends to watch this TV program. It'll appear 3 times a week during April 2023 on Channel 22 in Thurston County, Washington, every Monday at 1:30 p.m., every Wednesday at 5 p.m., and every Thursday at 9 p.m. But also it'll be on my blog starting in late March of 2023. And again, that's www.parallaxperspectives.org. Parallax has 1 R, 2 L's, PARALLAX perspectives.org. And then you'll see it there. Go ahead.
And I can also say that when I was looking at the roster of cases in the International Court of Justice, there are 2 against the United States.
Oh.
Palestinians have brought a charge against the United States for the decision about moving the embassy to Jerusalem. And Iran has, I'm not sure on what conditions, but they have brought a case to the ICJ against the United States.
Okay.
Sure, for maybe violating the terms of the JPCO5. I'm not sure. I don't remember that.
Okay.
But I just thought that was interesting that
yeah.
we're and we don't, of course, we don't hear about it because the charges are brought against us.
Right.
And because we don't like the court, we don't bring cases against other. Well, we did against.
Now, when you say we, you mean the U.S. government.
US government.
Yeah, and the mainstream media in the U.S. is very much subservient to the U.S. government's agenda and biases, and so the mainstream media in the U.S. do not talk about this stuff. Mainstream media in the U.S. don't even talk about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which the U.S. opposes because the U.S. government wants to have lots of nuclear weapons. So we need to get our news from other sources, including my TV program. So you can get information about a wide variety of issues related to peace, social justice, nonviolence, and dozens of other categories on my blog, parallaxperspectives.org, or you can phone me at 360-491-9093. We are all one human family. We all share one planet. We can create a better world, but we all have to work at it. And the world needs you and what you have to offer. So thanks for doing what you can.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you for joining us.